I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened in that courtroom. I have folded 13 flags in my life. 13 times I have knelt in front of a grieving mother, or a young widow, or a little boy who didn't understand yet why everyone was crying, and I have handed over the last piece of his father that anyone would ever hand him. I have never once dropped a fold. I have never once let my hands shake. But the day my ex-wife's lawyer stood up and told a judge that I was not fit to raise my own daughter, my hands shook so bad I had to sit on them under the table just to make it stop. My name is Daniel Cole. I go by Dan. For 11 years I served in the United States Army, and for the last 4 of those years, when I wasn't overseas, I served on a ceremonial honor guard detail out of Fort Sam Houston, folding flags for soldiers who didn't come home. And for the last 3 years, since my daughter Maddie turned 5, I have been raising her alone in a small rented house on the edge of San Antonio with a leaking kitchen faucet I never quite got around to fixing, and a refrigerator covered in her drawings of dogs that all somehow have 5 legs. Maddie is 8 now. She has her mother's stubborn chin and my mother's laugh, the kind that comes out too loud in movie theaters. She sleeps with a stuffed rabbit named Sergeant Hoppy that lost 1 ear in the washing machine 2 years ago, and that I have sewn back on 4 separate times because throwing him away was never, not once, going to be an option. She takes her cereal dry, in a bowl with the milk in a separate cup on the side, because one time when she was 5, she said the milk made the cereal go sad, and I have never questioned it since. I tell you all this because in 3 weeks I am supposed to walk into a courtroom and prove, on paper, in front of a judge who has never met my daughter and never watched her fall asleep with her head on my shoulder during the fireworks on the 4th of July, that I am a fit father, that the 8 years I have spent building a life around that little girl are worth more than the story my ex-wife's attorney is telling. And I need you to know how we got here. Because it did not start with a courtroom. It started, like most things in my life since I got out of the service, with a phone call I almost didn't answer. It was a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays are trash day on our street, and I was standing at the curb in gym shorts and an old unit t-shirt with a bag in each hand when my phone buzzed in my back pocket. I almost let it go to voicemail. I had learned, over the years, that most calls I got before 8 in the morning were either a wrong number, a scam about my car's extended warranty, or Rachel. It was Rachel. Dan, she said, and I could hear something in her voice right away, something tight and rehearsed, like she'd practiced the sentence in her car before she dialed. I'm filing for full custody. My lawyer's already drawing up the paperwork. I think it's time Maddie had some stability. I stood there on the curb with a bag of trash in each hand, and for a second I genuinely thought I had misheard her. Stability. That word landed on me like a slap, because stability was the one thing I had built, brick by brick, out of nothing, since the day Rachel packed 2 suitcases and told me she needed to find herself in Austin with a man she'd met at a conference. Stability was me learning how to braid hair from a YouTube video at 11 o'clock at night because Maddie had a school picture the next morning. Stability was 3 years of never missing a single pickup, not once, not even the week I had the flu so bad I could barely stand. Because I drove to that school with a bucket in the passenger seat rather than call someone else to go in my place. Rachel, I said, and I heard my own voice come out flatter than I meant it to, the way it used to go flat in briefings when something had gone very wrong and there wasn't time to feel it yet. Where is this coming from? You're gone all the time, she said. Every time I try to reach her on a Saturday, you're on duty. What kind of custody arrangement has the father disappearing for military funerals every other weekend? She needs a normal life, Dan. She needs a mother who's actually present, not shuffled between a rental house and whatever base you're driving to at 5 in the morning. I want to tell you I had a good comeback. I didn't. I stood there on Elm Street with 2 bags of trash going cold in my hands, and I said the only true thing I had, which was, I have never missed a pickup. Not once. That's not the point, she said, and hung up. I carried the trash to the curb like a man carrying something much heavier, and I stood there a minute, looking at my own house, the chipped porch railing I'd been meaning to sand down. The wind chime Maddie made in 2nd grade that never quite made a musical sound, more of a clatter, and I thought about the word unfit, even though she hadn't said it yet. I could feel it coming, the way you feel a storm coming before the sky changes, a pressure behind your ears. Inside, Maddie was still asleep. Her door cracked the way she liked it. Nightlight shaped like a fox glowing orange in the corner of her room. I stood in the hallway for a long time that morning before I woke her up for school, just listening to her breathe. The way I used to listen to the radio silence before contact, waiting to know if the quiet meant safety or just meant I hadn't heard the bad part yet. I should tell you about the honor guard, because that's the part Rachel's lawyer would later try to turn into a weapon, and it deserves better than that. After I left active duty, I could have walked away from all of it. Plenty of guys do, and there's no shame in it. But there was a chaplain I served under overseas, a soft-spoken man named Captain Reyes, who used to say that some of us carry things home that don't have anywhere else to go, and the honor guard was a place to put them down gently instead of setting them down hard. I joined the volunteer detail 3 years ago, not long after Rachel left, back when Maddie was 5, and I had more silence in that house than I knew what to do with. I do about 2 ceremonies a month now. Sometimes it's a World War II veteran, 90-something years old, buried with 3 family members left to grieve him. Sometimes it's a 23-year-old, and the family is so young themselves that they don't know yet how to stand at a graveside, and it's on me and the 5 other men and women on the detail to hold that line steady so they don't have to. I fold the flag. 13 folds, corner to corner, until it's a tight triangle of stars, no red showing. Because red showing means you did it wrong, and there is no room in that ceremony for wrong. I have done it in 90-degree heat with sweat running into my eyes, and I have done it in freezing rain in December with my hands so cold I couldn't feel the fabric, and I have never once let it show. Then, I kneel. I hand the flag to whoever is standing closest to that grief, a widow, a mother, once, unbearably, a 6-year-old boy who reached for it with both hands like it was the last warm thing in the world, and I say the words. On behalf of a grateful nation. I say them soft enough that they land like a hand on a shoulder and not like an announcement. I do this on Saturdays. Sometimes on weekdays, if a family requests it and I can get the time off from my job at the county's Veterans Services Office, which I also work full-time, Monday through Friday, helping other guys like me untangle their benefits paperwork so they don't fall through the same cracks I nearly did. Between the honor guard and the job and Maddie, my calendar looks like a losing game of Tetris most weeks. But I have never, not one single time, let it touch her school mornings, or her bedtime, or the promise I made her the night her mother left, which was simple and which I have kept every day since. I am not going anywhere. Rachel's lawyer, a sharp, tidy man named Aaron Pruitt, who wore cufflinks shaped like tiny anchors even though, as far as I know, he'd never served a day in his life, built his entire case around one idea. That a man who spends his weekends folding flags for dead strangers cannot be fully present for the living daughter in his own house. He didn't say it that bluntly, of course. Lawyers don't. He said things like erratic availability and prioritization concerns, and a pattern of divided attention. And every one of those phrases was a scalpel aimed at the same soft place, which was, does this man love something more than he loves his daughter? The custody evaluator's name was Miss Denise Okafor, a guardian ad litem the court assigned to interview Maddie, visit the house, and write a report that the judge would weigh heavily. She was a small, precise woman who took notes in handwriting so neat it looked typed, and the first time she came to our house, I was so nervous I over-cleaned everything, scrubbing the baseboards at 11 at night like the fate of my daughter's life hinged on the state of the baseboards. Which, in a way that made me sick to think about. It might. Maddie, of course, was completely unbothered by any of it. She showed Miss Okafor her rock collection, insisted on giving her a full tour that included the exact spot on the porch where she'd once seen a lizard the size of a hot dog, and asked, with the devastating honesty only an 8-year-old possesses, "Are you the lady deciding if I get to stay with my dad?" Miss Okafor, to her credit, knelt down to Maddie's eye level and said gently, "I'm the lady making sure you're safe and happy, wherever you are." "I'm happy here," Maddie said, without a beat of hesitation, and something in my chest that had been clenched for 2 straight weeks finally loosened. Just a little. But happy, it turned out, was not going to be enough on its own. 2 days later, Miss Okafor called to schedule a follow-up visit, and in the careful, neutral tone that professionals use when they're about to say something you don't want to hear, she told me she'd need to speak with me about my schedule. About what she called the honor guard commitment. About whether, given my job and my volunteer duties, I could truly provide the consistent, present parenting the court would be looking for. I sat on my back porch that night after Maddie was asleep, phone in my hand, staring at a text from Rachel's lawyer's office confirming the court date, and for the first time since she'd left, I let myself feel something close to fear. Not fear of Rachel. Fear that a system built to protect children might look at the folded flags in my closet, the dress uniform I keep pressed and ready on a hanger behind the door, the 2-way radio I still carry to the cemetery in case a family needs anything during a service, and see a man who is somewhere else. When the truth, the whole entire truth, was that every single fold I had ever made was for a family, just like mine. A family that lost someone too soon. And every time I did it, I thought of Maddie. I thought of what I would want someone to do for her, God forbid if it were ever me in that flag. I thought of the promise a stranger makes to a grieving family with his hands, and how that promise and the promise I made to my daughter were, in my chest, the exact same promise, wearing 2 different uniforms. I didn't know yet how to explain that to a courtroom. I only knew I had 3 weeks to figure it out, and that the man I'd have to convince wasn't Aaron Pruitt, or even the judge. It was going to be Rachel. The days that followed moved the way days move when you're bracing for something too slow and too fast at the same time. I kept Maddie's routine exactly as it had always been, because if there was one thing I could control, it was that. Cereal dry, milk on the side. Homework at the kitchen table with the radio playing low, classic rock, because that's what she'd grown up hearing me hum while I cooked. Bedtime at 8:30 on school nights, Sergeant Hoppy tucked under her chin, the Fox night light glowing steady in the corner. But underneath the routine, I was unraveling in small, private ways nobody saw. I stopped sleeping well. I'd lie awake running through everything Aaron Pruitt might say, everything Rachel might have told her lawyer about nights I'd come home late from a ceremony, dress blues still on, exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with the body, and everything to do with the part of you that just spent an hour absorbing someone else's worst day. I started keeping a log dates, times, every pickup, every school event, every honor guard ceremony cross referenced against who'd watched Maddie and for how long. Which turned out, without exception, to be nobody. because I never once left her with a sitter during a ceremony. I brought her with me twice, when Rachel had canceled a weekend at the last minute, and there was no one else. She sat in the front row, in a little black dress I'd bought her for her grandmother's funeral the year before, hands folded in her lap, watching me fold that flag with an expression so solemn and so proud that one of the widows that day, an 80-year-old woman named Corinne Betts, had reached over afterward and taken Maddie's small hand in both of hers and said, "Your daddy gave my husband the only peace I've had all week, sweetheart. You remember that?" I didn't know it then, but Corinne Betts's name was about to matter a great deal more than I could have imagined. 3 days before the court date, I got a call from Miss Okafor asking to do one final observation a full Saturday, start to finish, including if it happened to fall on a ceremony day, the ceremony itself. I checked the schedule. There was, in fact, a service that Saturday. A young soldier, 26 years old, killed in a training accident stateside, being laid to rest at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. His mother had specifically requested our detail because her son, before he enlisted, used to volunteer at the same cemetery mowing grass around the headstones as a teenager, and she wanted the send-off to feel like coming home. I told Miss Okafor yes. Come, watch all of it. I didn't know if it would help my case or bury it, but I was done trying to hide the parts of my life that made me who I was, especially not from the one person whose job it was to see the whole of me clearly. What none of us knew, not me, not Miss Okafor, not even Rachel, who I later learned had decided, almost on impulse, almost against her own lawyer's advice, to drive to that cemetery herself that Saturday morning, just to see, was that this ordinary, aching, beautiful Saturday was about to become the thing that decided everything. People who have never raised a kid alone tend to imagine that the hard part is the big stuff, the diagnosis at 2 a.m, the school call that makes your stomach drop, the arguments in a courtroom. And sure, those things are hard, but most of what actually built the life Maddie and I have together happened in pieces so small nobody would ever think to put them in a filing. It happened in the 2 minutes every morning when I have to guess, correctly, whether today is a day she wants her hair in 1 braid or 2, because guessing wrong means we're both late and both a little sad about it for reasons neither of us can quite name. It happened in the specific order she needs her breakfast-served cereal first, then the milk cup set down beside it, never poured, never touched. An entire architecture of a 7-year-old's dignity resting on that order being respected exactly. I work 5 days a week at the county's Veterans Services Office, in a beige building off Culebra Road, with a broken vending machine in the lobby that has eaten more of my dollar bills than I care to admit. My job, on paper, is helping veterans navigate disability claims, benefits paperwork, the whole tangled bureaucracy that nearly swallowed me whole the year I got out and didn't know which forms went where or who to call when nobody called back. In practice, my job is mostly sitting across a desk from men and women who remind me, in one way or another, of myself 5 years ago, tired, proud, reluctant to ask for help, even when help is sitting right there, waiting to be asked for. There was a man who came into my office about a month before Rachel's filing, a gruff, silent Vietnam veteran named Walt Prentice, who'd been denied benefits 3 separate times over 18 years because of a paperwork error nobody before me had bothered to actually trace back to its source. Walt sat across from my desk that day with his cap in his lap, turning it over and over in his hands, and told me, in about 9 total sentences over the course of an hour, that he'd basically given up trying. "Nobody reads the file all the way through," he said. "They see the denial code and they stop. I read the file all the way through. It took me 3 nights, working late after Maddie was asleep, cross-referencing dates on a laptop at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Until I found it a single transposed digit in a service dates field from 1974 that had been quietly propagating through every subsequent review for 18 years, making it look, on paper, like Walt's claimed exposure didn't line up with his deployment window, when in fact it lined up exactly. I filed the correction myself, walked it through 3 different departments by hand because I didn't trust it to survive another round of mail, and 6 weeks later, Walt Prentice called my office, and when I picked up, he didn't say hello. He just said, 18 years. And then he didn't say anything else for a long moment, and neither did I, because some silences don't need filling. I tell you about Walt because it matters for understanding what kind of unfit father the court was being asked to believe existed. The man Aaron Pruitt described in his filings divided, distracted, prioritizing strangers over his own daughter was not a man capable of spending 3 unpaid nights tracing a single transposed digit through 18 years of paperwork for someone he'd known for one afternoon. That's not distraction. That's the same stubborn refusal to let anyone slip through the cracks that had me driving to Maddie's school with a bucket in my passenger seat rather than miss a pickup while running a fever of 102. Maddie knows Walt a little. He came to her school's Veterans Day assembly that November at my invitation and stood at the back of the gymnasium in a faded VFW cap while a room full of 8-year-olds recited the Pledge of Allegiance with the particular off-rhythm sincerity only children manage. Afterward, Maddie marched right up to him. She has never once in her life understood the concept of being intimidated by an adult she hasn't decided to be intimidated by, and asked him what war he was in. And when he told her, she asked with total seriousness whether he'd ever seen a tank up close, and Walt, who I had watched go 9 sentences in an hour in my office, spent the next 20 minutes telling my daughter about the exact sound a tank engine makes when it idles, while she listened with her chin propped on both fists, utterly rapt. "He's nice," she told me in the car afterward. "He talks slow, but he's nice." "He is," I agreed. "Is he gonna get his money now? The stuff you fixed?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror, surprised, because I genuinely hadn't thought she was paying attention the handful of times I'd mentioned Walt's case at the dinner table, half to myself, working through the tangle out loud the way I sometimes do. "Yeah, Bug," I said. "He is. Good," she said, with the flat, satisfied certainty of a kid who believes, correctly, that the world should occasionally work out the way it's supposed to. That's what you're supposed to do when somebody's stuck. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count since the day she said it, mostly during the 3 weeks I spent bracing for a courtroom, wondering how anyone looking at my life could conclude that the instinct she'd just described, "that's what you're supposed to do when somebody's stuck," was somehow a liability instead of the exact thing that made me capable of loving her the way I do. There were smaller moments, too, the kind that never make it into a custody filing, but that, strung together, are the actual architecture of a life. There was the Tuesday I burned an entire tray of grilled cheese sandwiches black because I got distracted proofreading a benefits appeal letter at the stove, and Maddie ate the least burnt one without a single complaint and declared, with a straight face, that extra crispy was actually her favorite. A kindness so specific and so clearly manufactured on the spot that I had to turn away from her at the sink so she wouldn't see my eyes go wet over a ruined sandwich. There was the Saturday morning I spent 45 minutes on the bathroom floor trying to get a French braid to lie flat for her cousin's birthday party, following a video paused and rewound so many times the narrator's voice had worn a groove into my brain, while Maddie critiqued my technique with the merciless honesty of an 8-year-old who has clearly seen better braids in her short life. There was the school project on family history, where she stood up in front of her whole 3rd grade class and told them, unprompted, that her dad makes sure people who died get to go home the right way. A sentence so much more precise and more beautiful than anything I could have said myself that her teacher, Mrs. Alvarado, mentioned it to me at pickup with tears standing openly in her eyes. I think about that sentence a lot. Makes sure people who died get to go home the right way. An 8-year-old distilled in 11 words. Something I have spent years failing to fully explain to adults with law degrees. Mrs. Alvarado, as it happened, ended up writing one of the letters in Priya's 3-inch folder unprompted, entirely on her own initiative, after she heard through the parent grapevine what was happening. She wrote that in 15 years of teaching, she had never had a parent volunteer for more classroom activities, chaperone more field trips around a demanding work schedule, or show up more consistently to every single event on the school calendar, often in a work uniform straight from a shift, sometimes with visible exhaustion on his face that he never once let interfere with his attention to his daughter. She wrote, in a line Priya read aloud to me over the phone, with her voice noticeably unsteady. I have taught the children of surgeons, lawyers, and executives who could not manage a fraction of the presence Daniel Cole brings to his daughter's life around a schedule far more demanding than most of theirs. I didn't cry reading that letter, not exactly. But I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, with the phone still in my hand, looking at the refrigerator covered in 5-legged dogs. And I let myself feel, for the first time in weeks, something other than fear. I let myself feel, just for a minute, like maybe the people who actually knew our life, not the story being told about it in a filing, but the actual daily texture of it, were going to be enough to hold the truth together when it mattered most. It would still be nearly 2 more weeks before Miss Okafor called about the cemetery visit, before Rachel stood at the back of a stranger's funeral and watched something in her own certainty quietly break apart, before a judge folded his glasses on the bench and said the word dismissed. But looking back now, I think the case was never really won in that courtroom at all. I think it was won in 100 small, unglamorous moments. Nobody was watching a burnt grilled cheese sandwich, a badly done braid, a transposed digit traced through 18 years of paperwork, a little girl standing up in front of her class to say, in her own words, exactly who her father was, long before anyone with a law degree ever had the chance to tell her otherwise. There is a version of this story where I tell you the hardest part was the paperwork, or the lawyer's fees, or the long nights lying awake running numbers I didn't have. And all of that was hard, don't get me wrong. But the hardest part, the part that actually kept me up until 2 and 3 in the morning some nights, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles above my bed, was Rachel's mother. Her name is Sandra Voss, and for the 11 years I was married to her daughter, she never once called me by my first name. It was always Daniel, said with a particular flatness, the same tone you'd use for a delivery driver or a plumber who'd shown up late. Sandra had never wanted Rachel to marry a soldier in the first place. She had a picture in her head of the life her daughter deserved, a house in a nicer part of town, a husband in a suit who came home at 6 every evening and never once had to explain what a deployment was to a 5-year-old, and I don't think, in 11 years, I ever stopped being, in Sandra's eyes, a disappointment Rachel had settled for. When Rachel filed for custody, Sandra was, by all accounts I heard secondhand, the one who pushed hardest. She sat in on 2 of the early meetings with Aaron Pruitt. She was the one, according to my sister, who first used the word unfit out loud at a family dinner in front of people who then repeated it to other people until it found its way back to me through 3 different mouths before I ever heard it from Rachel or her lawyer directly. I remember exactly where I was the day I found out Sandra had said it. I was standing in my kitchen making Maddie's lunch turkey and cheese, crusts cut off, an apple cut into slices because whole apples hurt her teeth, for reasons she has never fully explained, and my sister Kelly called to warn me. Her voice careful in the way people get when they're about to hand you something that's going to hurt. "She's calling you unfit, Dan," Kelly said. At dinner, in front of the cousins. I stood there with the paring knife in my hand, halfway through an apple, and I felt something go very still and very cold in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and worse. A kind of grief for the version of myself Sandra Voss had apparently decided existed some careless, absent man who left his daughter to fend for herself while he played dress up in a uniform on weekends. A caricature with none of my actual face on it. "Say something," Kelly said. "There's nothing to say to her," I told my sister, and I finished cutting the apple. Because Maddie's bus came at 7:40, and there was no version of my grief that was going to make her late for school. But it followed me. That's the part nobody warns you about when a piece of your character gets put on trial. It doesn't just live in the courtroom. It lives in the grocery store, when you run into someone from your old church group, and you can see, in the half-second before they say hello, that they've heard something. It lives in the parent pickup line at Maddie's school, where a mother I'd known casually for 2 years suddenly couldn't quite meet my eyes. Word travels in a town like ours, especially in the tight, gossiping orbit of a school community, and by the second week, I could feel it a coolness in places that used to be warm, a hesitation in people who used to wave without thinking twice. The worst of it came from a man named Curtis Boyle, whose son Tyler was in Maddie's class, and who had, until that point, been someone I considered a friend. We'd coached the same rec league soccer team the spring before, split a cooler of drinks on the sideline, more Saturdays than I could count. Curtis cornered me in the school parking lot one afternoon, not unkindly, but with the particular bluntness of a man who thinks he's doing you a favor by saying the hard thing out loud. "Heard about the custody thing," he said, leaning against my truck like we were still the kind of friends who leaned against each other's trucks. "Look, I don't know the whole story. But you gotta admit, man, running off to funerals every other weekend, leaving a kid with a sitter that doesn't look great on paper." "I've never once left her with a sitter for a ceremony," I said, and I could hear the exhaustion in my own voice, the specific tiredness of correcting the same misunderstanding for the 40th time. "She comes with me sometimes. I've never left her anywhere she didn't want to be." Curtis held up both hands, the universal gesture of a man backing out of a conversation he'd started without thinking through where it might go. "Hey, I'm not trying to pile on. I'm just saying, people talk. You should get ahead of it." I didn't know how to get ahead of a story that had already outrun me, one whispered dinner table at a time. So instead I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was the next right thing directly in front of me. I picked Maddie up. I made her turkey and cheese sandwiches with the crusts cut off. I braided her hair badly and let her fix it herself in the bathroom mirror while I stood behind her, failing to hide how much it hurt that a version of me was circulating through this town that had almost nothing to do with the man actually standing in that bathroom. There was one night, about 10 days before the ceremony, that would change everything, when it nearly broke something in me. Maddie had a bad dream. She still gets them sometimes, ever since Rachel moved out, dreams about houses with doors that won't open, and she came padding into my room at nearly 1 in the morning, Sergeant Hoppy dragging behind her by one paw. "Dad," she whispered, standing at the edge of my bed. "Is Mom gonna win?" I sat up so fast I nearly knocked the lamp off the nightstand. "Win what?" "Bug. The court thing," she said, and her voice was so small and so careful, like she was handling something fragile just by asking it out loud. "Grandma Sandra said, you might not get to be my dad anymore. Not really, like on TV, where the kid only sees their dad on weekends." I pulled her up onto the bed, tucked her against my side the way I have since she was a baby too small to hold any other way. And I felt something in my chest crack open with a rage I did not let show in my voice, not even a little, because that rage belonged to me and not to her. I will always be your dad, I told her. That doesn't change no matter what any court decides. Do you understand me? That's not a thing a piece of paper can take away. But what if I have to live somewhere else? Then I will still be your dad every single day, whether you're down the hall or across town, I said. And I meant every word of it with everything I had, even as some small, terrified part of me wondered if I actually believed it, or if I was simply saying the thing a father is supposed to say to a frightened 8-year-old at 1 a.m. You are never going to lose me, Maddie. Not ever. That's a promise, and I have never once broken a promise to you. She was quiet for a long time, tracing the frayed seam on Sergeant Hoppy's ear with one finger, and then she said, in the small, matter-of-fact way children sometimes deliver the truths adults spend their whole lives circling, I don't think Grandma Sandra likes you very much. I almost laughed, despite everything, despite the ache still sitting heavy in my chest. No, I agreed. I don't think she does. Why? I thought about it for a long moment, because I owed her an honest answer, even a simplified one. I think some people build a picture in their head of how life is supposed to look, I said finally. And when real life doesn't match the picture, it's easier for them to be mad at the real life than to change the picture. Maddie considered that with the seriousness she gives to most things, the seriousness of a girl who once spent 4 days building an elaborate defense of why a stray cat deserved to live under our porch rent, free. That's dumb, she said finally. Yeah, I agreed, kissing the top of her head. It kind of is. She fell asleep against my side that night, and I lay there long after her breathing evened out, staring at the ceiling fan, thinking about Sandra Voss's picture of a life, and about my own life, the actual one, imperfect and threadbare in places, but stitched together with more love than that picture could ever hold. I thought about the leaking kitchen faucet I still hadn't fixed, and the 5-legged dogs taped to the refrigerator, and the exact way Maddie said go sad about milk and cereal, and I thought, not for the first time, that if a courtroom couldn't see the shape of a real family just because it didn't come with a matching set of furniture, then maybe the courtroom was the one with the problem, not me. But I couldn't afford to think like that for long. I had a case to prepare, a lawyer of my own, a tired, kind, overworked public interest attorney named Priya Nair, who took my case for a fraction of her usual rate because, she told me plainly at our first meeting, I've watched too many good fathers get buried by paperwork they didn't know how to fight. I spent every evening for 2 weeks after Maddie went to bed sitting at my kitchen table with Priya on speakerphone, building a record, a folder, eventually 3 inches thick, of school pickup logs, teacher emails praising my involvement, a letter from Maddie's 2nd-grade teacher describing me as one of the most present parents I have encountered in 15 years of teaching. Photographs of every single school event I'd ever attended, every science fair, every awkward middle-of-the-day grandparents and special friends day where I'd shown up in my work clothes because I couldn't take the whole afternoon off, but I could take an hour, and I always took the hour. Priya looked over that folder the night before the original hearing date, the one that would eventually never happen because of what occurred at Fort Sam Houston, and she said something I've held on to ever since. Dan, she said, tapping the folder with one finger, this isn't a case about whether you're a good father. Anyone who reads this can see that in about 4 pages. This is a case about whether the court understands what your service actually is. Right now, in their mind, it's a hobby competing with your daughter for your time. Our job is to help them see it's not competing with anything. It's the same instinct, wearing a different uniform. I didn't know yet how true that sentence would turn out to be, or how it would end up being proven not by anything Priya said in a courtroom, but by an 86-year-old widow named Corinne Betts, standing quietly at the back of a funeral, watching a little girl in a black dress hold her father's hand. Saturday came in gray and still, the kind of overcast Texas morning where the heat hasn't decided yet whether it's going to burn through the clouds or not. I was up before 5, the way I always am on ceremony days, pressing my dress blues in the kitchen while the coffee maker gurgled behind me and Maddie slept down the hall. I have a ritual for these mornings, one I never talk about because it sounds strange out loud, but I'll tell you now. I lay the uniform out on the ironing board, and before I press a single crease, I say the name of the soldier we're burying that day. Out loud, once, to the empty kitchen. That morning it was Corporal Ethan Marsh, 26 years old. I said his name to my kitchen at 5:15 in the morning, and then I got to work. Maddie padded out around 6:30, hair a wild nest around her face, Sergeant Hoppy dangling from one hand, and climbed onto a kitchen chair to watch me finish getting ready. She has done this since she was 5. She doesn't say much during it. She just watches, chin propped on her fists, as I check my brass, straighten my ribbons, make sure my shoes could pass for mirrors. That morning she said, out of nowhere, in the flat honest way kids say the biggest things, "Do you get sad every time?" I stopped buttoning my jacket and looked at her. "Every time," I said. "But sad isn't always a bad thing to feel, Bug. Sometimes it means you're doing something that matters." She nodded like that made perfect, complete sense to her, the way kids nod at things adults spend their whole lives trying to understand, and went back to eating her cereal, dry, milk on the side. Miss Okafor arrived at the house at 7:30 sharp, in a gray blazer, notebook already in hand, and rode with us to the cemetery in near silence, the radio off, Maddie in the back seat in her black dress, quietly braiding a strand of Sergeant Hoppy's frayed ear seam the way she does when she's thinking. Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in the early morning is one of the most beautiful and most brutal places I know. Rows of white headstones stretching out under live oaks, so uniform and so endless that from certain angles it looks less like a place people are buried and more like a place people are standing at attention. Forever, we arrived early, as we always do, and I left Maddie and Miss Okafor in the family staging area with instructions to stay put, and I went to join my detail. There were 6 of us that morning. Staff Sergeant Alvarez, retired, who has bad knees and never once let it show during a ceremony. Corporal Bishop, the youngest of us, 29, who still gets tears in his eyes every single time no matter how many services he's worked, and has never once apologized for it. And the others, Reyes, Tran, Whitfield, and me, all of us bound by the same quiet oath, which nobody ever wrote down but all of us understood. Whatever this family is feeling today, we carry the weight so they don't have to carry all of it alone. The hearse came at 9. Corporal Marsh's mother, a small woman named Diane with her son's same square jaw, walked behind it on the arm of a young man I later learned was her surviving son, Ethan's older brother. Behind them came a line of people so long it took nearly 10 minutes to pass high school teachers, coaches, a whole row of young men and women in matching football jerseys with Marsh's old number on the back, and, near the end of the line, an elderly woman moving slowly with a cane. That was Corinne Betts. I saw her and felt something tighten pleasantly in my chest. She recognized me too. Gave me the smallest nod, the kind 2 people share when they've stood at the same kind of grief before and don't need words for it. The service itself, I won't describe in full, because some things aren't mine to hand out in detail, even now. I'll tell you only what matters for this story. The chaplain spoke. The rifle volley cracked 3 times across that quiet field, and I watched. As I always do, the exact moment it lands in a mother's body, the way her shoulders drop like something inside her gave out just slightly. Taps played, and somewhere behind me, I heard a sound I will never forget for the rest of my life. My own daughter, 8 years old, crying softly into Miss Okafor's shoulder, not because she knew Corporal Marsh, but because she is, underneath everything, a person with a heart so wide open it has never learned how to protect itself, and I have never once wished that she'd learn. Then it was time to fold the flag. I want you to understand what 13 folds looks like when you've done it as many times as I have. It isn't mechanical. Each one has to be perfect. But perfect isn't the goal, reverence is the goal. And perfect is just the shape reverence takes when your hands know exactly what they're doing. Alvarez and I worked in total silence, the wind pulling gently at the fabric until it became a tight, star-covered triangle that I held against my chest for 1 full second before I turned and knelt in front of Diane Marsh. I said the words, "On behalf of the President of the United States and the Department of the Army and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." Diane Marsh took the flag from my hands the way you'd take something alive, cradled it against her stomach, and looked at me not through me. The way some people do in that moment, lost entirely in their own grief, but directly at me, and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Thank you for making sure he wasn't alone." I have heard some version of that sentence 11 times now, at 11 different graves, and it has never once stopped landing exactly the same way. Like a hand closing gently around something inside my ribs, I stood, stepped back into formation, and it was only then, scanning the crowd out of old habit. A habit from a different kind of duty in a different kind of country, that I saw her. Rachel. She was standing near the back, half hidden behind a live oak, in the same gray coat she used to wear to our old church back when we were married, and she was crying. Not the composed, distant kind of crying people sometimes do at funerals out of general human sympathy. She was crying the way you cry when something you believed about the world just quietly, permanently cracked. I didn't approach her. That wasn't the place, and honestly, some professional part of me that has stood through 11 of these ceremonies knew that the moment belonged to Diane Marsh and her family, not to whatever was unraveling in my ex-wife's chest. I finished the ceremony. I helped fold the flag stand, shook hands with the family as they filed out, told Diane Marsh, quietly, that her son's mother's love had clearly built the kind of man who ran toward things other people ran from. And then I walked back to the staging area where Maddie sat next to Miss Okafor, eyes still red, Sergeant Hoppy pressed to her chest. "You okay, Bug?" I asked, crouching down to her level, uniform and all. She nodded, and then, in the way that only children can say the truest thing in the room without meaning to, she said, "I liked watching you take care of her. The mom. You were really gentle." Miss Okafor was writing something in her notebook. I didn't ask what. Rachel found me 20 minutes later, near the parking lot, after most of the crowd had cleared. She still had her coat pulled tight around her even though the day had warmed into the 70s, arms crossed like she was holding herself together with them. "I didn't know," she said, before I could say anything at all. "Dan, I thought she stopped, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second, and started again. Aaron kept saying weekend commitments, and I pictured you at some kind of, I don't know, a reenactment club, or a hobby, something you were choosing over her. I didn't picture this. It's not a hobby," I said, and I kept my voice even. Because I had promised myself a long time ago I would never let this particular conversation turn into a fight in front of our daughter, even from 30 feet away. It's the same thing I did for 11 years in uniform, Rachel, making sure nobody gets left behind. I just do it for people who already didn't come home instead of people still fighting to. She looked past me, toward Diane Marsh, who was being helped into a car by her surviving son, the folded flag still cradled against her chest, like something she'd never set down again. "That little boy," Rachel said quietly. "The one Maddie told me about once, from a different funeral." "You held his hand the whole time," she said. "I remember him," I said. "I did. Every one of them." "I built a whole story in my head," Rachel said, and her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since the worst nights of our marriage. Back when things were falling apart, and neither of us knew how to say so out loud. "I told myself you were choosing something else. Because it was easier than admitting I left, and you stayed, and somehow you built a better life for her out of the wreckage than I ever managed to build for myself." I didn't say anything right away. There wasn't a version of that moment that needed me to win it. So I just said, "She's happy, Rachel. That's not a story. You can ask her yourself. You can ask Miss Okafor. I've never once put anything ahead of her, and I'm not going to start defending myself for something that isn't true." Rachel nodded, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, and looked over at where Maddie stood a little ways off, half hidden behind Miss Okafor, watching us with the particular caution kids develop when they've learned that grown-up conversations can turn into storms without warning. "I'm going to call Aaron," Rachel said. "Tonight, I'm going to tell him to withdraw the filing." I felt something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 3 straight weeks finally begin to loosen, but I didn't let myself celebrate yet, because I've learned, in more places than a courtroom, that things aren't finished until they're finished. "I'd still like to go in front of the judge," I said, and Rachel looked at me, surprised, "Not to fight you. Just so it's on the record, clean, that this isn't a fear we have to carry around for the next 10 years. Maddie deserves that too. An ending, not just a pause." Rachel thought about that for a long moment, arms still wrapped around herself, and then she nodded. "Before I tell you what happened after the cemetery, I need to back up and tell you about the courtroom itself. Because even though Rachel had already decided in the parking lot that she wanted to withdraw the case, Priya Nair insisted we go through with the hearing anyway, in full, on the record. "Withdrawn filings can be refiled," she told me, sitting across my kitchen table 2 nights before, tapping a pen against her legal pad. "I want a judge's finding in writing. I want this closed so tight that it never opens again, not in a year, not in 5 years, not the next time Sandra Voss has a bad Thanksgiving and decides to stir the pot." So we went. All of us. Rachel sat beside Aaron Pruitt, who looked, for the first time since I'd met him, genuinely uncertain what he was supposed to be arguing for. I sat beside Priya, my dress blues hanging untouched at home because Priya had told me, firmly, to wear a plain gray suit, instead let the record speak for the uniform, she said. "You don't need to wear it to prove it exists." Judge Holloway had a way of looking over his glasses that made you feel, for one uncomfortable second, entirely transparent, like he could see straight through whatever version of yourself you'd dressed up for the occasion. He'd clearly read the file overnight. Because he opened by saying, "I have here a folder from Mr. Cole's counsel that is, by my count, roughly 3 inches thick, and a filing from petitioner's counsel that runs 4 pages. I'd like someone to explain to me what happened between the filing of this petition and this morning, because something has clearly shifted." Aaron Pruitt stood first, straightened his tiny anchor cufflinks, and said, with the careful diplomacy of a man trying to retreat gracefully from a position he'd argued for weeks, Your Honor. My client has had occasion to gain additional context regarding respondent's schedule and community commitments and wishes to withdraw the petition for full custody at this time. I see, Judge Holloway said, and turned his attention to Miss Okafor, who was seated in the gallery with her neat folder open on her lap. Miss Okafor, you filed a supplemental report yesterday afternoon. I read it twice. I'd like you to summarize it for the record, if you would. Miss Okafor stood, smoothed her folder, and I felt Priya's hand find mine under the table. A small, steadying pressure. Your Honor, over the course of my evaluation, I observed Mr. Cole in a range of settings: his home, his daughter's school, a community volunteer commitment involving ceremonial honor guard duty at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. I want to be direct about something in my initial concerns, because I think it matters for the record. When I first learned of the extent of Mr. Cole's honor guard commitment, I shared some of the same reservations that appear to have motivated this filing. On paper, it presents as a significant recurring time commitment outside standard employment. My concern was whether that commitment could coexist with the consistency a child in Maddie's position requires. She paused, and I watched her look, briefly, at Maddie, who was sitting outside the courtroom in the hallway with my sister Kelly, coloring, blessedly unaware of the exact weight of the conversation happening on the other side of that door. What I observed, Miss Okafor continued, changed my assessment entirely. Mr. Cole has never, in any documented instance, left his daughter in the care of someone she was not already close to and comfortable with during a ceremony obligation. On occasions when childcare was unavailable, he brought her with him rather than compromise her routine or her sense of security. I observed a full ceremony on the Saturday in question. I want to note for the record that what I witnessed was not a father divided between two obligations. It was a father whose sense of duty operates as a single, consistent value system, applied both to his daughter and to the families he serves in a volunteer capacity. In 11 years of conducting these evaluations, Your Honor, I have rarely seen a parent whose stated values and observed behavior aligned so completely. She sat down. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Holloway turned to me next. Mr. Cole, I'd like to hear from you directly if you're willing. Not your attorney. You, I stood, and Priya gave my hand one more small squeeze before letting go. I had not prepared a speech. I had prepared documents, receipts, timestamps, everything Priya told me a judge would want to see on paper, but I had not prepared words. Because some part of me, I think, had been afraid that if I let myself say the truth of it out loud in advance, it would lose whatever made it true in the first place. Your Honor, I said, 11 years ago, I put on a uniform because I believed in something bigger than myself. 3 years ago, my wife left, and I put my daughter to bed alone for the first time, and I made her a promise that I was not going anywhere. Those two things, the uniform and the promise, have never once felt like they were competing with each other. When I fold a flag for a mother who just lost her son, I am not leaving my daughter behind to do it. I am doing for a stranger's family exactly what I would want someone to do for mine. God forbid it ever came to that. My daughter has watched me do this work. She has cried at a stranger's funeral because her heart is wide open, and I have never once been ashamed of that. And I am not going to start being ashamed of it now because someone decided it made good evidence in a filing. I have never missed a pickup. I have never missed a birthday, a school play, a fever in the middle of the night. I don't need a courtroom to tell me I'm her father, but I would like one, respectfully, to stop pretending that a man who kneels in front of grieving strangers to give them the last piece of dignity anyone will ever hand them is somehow the same man who'd walk away from his own child. Those two men have never existed in the same body. Not for one single day. I sat back down. My hands, under the table, were shaking again, the same way they'd shaken the day Rachel first called, except this time it wasn't fear making them shake. I genuinely don't know what it was. Something closer to relief, maybe, finally let loose after weeks of being held tight in a fist behind my ribs. Rachel spoke last, standing without being asked, which visibly surprised her own attorney. Your Honor, I filed this petition because I was afraid, and fear made a story easier to believe than the truth. I want the record to reflect that Daniel Cole is an exceptional father, that our daughter is safe, loved, and thriving in his care, and that I withdraw this filing not because my attorney advised it, but because I watched, with my own eyes, exactly what my daughter has been watching for 3 years. I was wrong. I'd like that on the record too, not just the withdrawal. Judge Holloway took off his glasses, folded them, and set them on the bench in front of him, which I would learn later from Priya was, for him, an unusually informal gesture. I don't often get filings like this one, he said. Most days in this courtroom, I watch two people try to win. I want to note for the record, formally, that this petition is dismissed with prejudice. That this court finds no basis whatsoever for concerns regarding Mr. Cole's fitness as a custodial parent, and that I hope, going forward, this family finds its way to cooperation rather than courtrooms. Miss Whitfield, Mr. Cole, you have a daughter who is, by every account in this file, remarkably well loved. I don't say that often either. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down soft, more of a tap than a strike, and it was over. Just like that, 3 weeks of dread collapsed into a single quiet sentence and the scrape of chairs. Maddie was waiting in the hallway, still coloring, and when the door opened and she saw both our faces, she didn't ask a single question. She just stood up, walked between us, and took a hand in each of hers, the exact same gesture she'd make months later on the courthouse lawn, except this was the first time, and I remember thinking, watching her small hand fit into mine, that I had spent 3 weeks terrified of losing something that, in the end, had never actually been fragile at all. It had just been misunderstood. Sandra Voss was not in that courtroom. I don't know if she ever apologized to Rachel, or to me, or if she simply let the whole thing quietly disappear the way people sometimes do when they're wrong, and don't quite have the words for saying so directly. I saw her once, months later, at Maddie's school play, sitting 3 rows back, and when our eyes met across the auditorium, she gave me a small nod, not warm, not particularly kind, but different from the flat Daniel she'd used for 11 years. It wasn't an apology. But it was, I think, as close as Sandra Voss was ever going to get to one. And I decided, for Maddie's sake more than my own, that it was enough to let it be. That night, after Rachel had gone home and Maddie was finally, exhaustedly asleep with Sergeant Hoppy tucked under her chin and the Fox night light glowing steady in the corner of her room, I stood in my kitchen the way I do on every ceremony night. Except this time there was no uniform to press. I just stood there, in the quiet, and I thought about Corporal Ethan Marsh, and Diane Marsh, cradling that flag like something alive, and Corinne Betts's hand closing around my daughter's small fingers months earlier, and I understood something I don't think I could have explained to a courtroom even if they'd given me all the time in the world. The thing that almost cost me my daughter was never a weakness in me. It was the exact same thing that made me capable of raising her well in the first place, the plain, stubborn belief that nobody, not a fallen soldier, not a grieving mother, not one single small girl with a one-eared stuffed rabbit, should ever have to feel like they've been left behind. I have folded 14 flags now. The 14th was 2 weeks after that hearing, another young soldier, another grieving mother, and this time, when I knelt to hand her the flag, I glanced up once and saw Maddie sitting quietly in the front row beside Rachel. Both of them watching me with the same expression, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like I was standing at that graveside alone, carrying two lives that couldn't quite fit together. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like the folding was finally, fully, done, that whatever I'd been carrying for other families all those years had, without my ever quite noticing it, folded itself into something whole enough to hold my own family too.